Ask and you shall receive. Colin's Last Stand now has a weekly podcast dedicated to, well, everything. It's called Fireside Chats, and video games, music, the meaning of life, and dealing with anxiety are just a few of the topics the show has touched on so far. Please subscribe to and download Fireside Chats on iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast services, or simply go to soundcloud.com/ColinsLastStand for the latest episode. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Colin's Last Stand right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty. I hope all of you out there are doing very well and that this video finds you well rested and hopeful. Today, I want to jump back to history because I feel like we've been doing a lot of political content lately and I really want to kind of balance it out more with history, but I'm going to do something a little bit different. There's a story that I've been wanting to tell you guys for a long time now. It was actually brought to my attention by a Patreon supporter over at patreon.com/ColinsLastStand during one of my monthly Q&A videos that I do with $10 and up supporters. He asked me, what did I think about the theory that years between like 600 and 900 never actually happened? It's this conspiracy theory called the phantom time hypothesis. And I had never heard of it. I'd never heard of it in my life. So after he asked that, I started reading about it, and it's extremely strange. So today's video is dedicated to what if 300 years of history, 297 years in fact, never actually happened. Let's go. You may think that this year is 2017, but what if it wasn't so? The phantom time hypothesis contends that the years 614 to 911 CE, CE meaning the Common Era, never actually happened, which, if true, would cut a full 297 years off of what we look at as known, established human history. The phantom time hypothesis says that today, we're living in the year 1720, and that the ruse goes far back, hundreds of years, to a darker, more dire, and far more illiterate time in human history. It's a fascinating and entirely harmless conspiracy theory to briefly explore, even though it's absolutely demonstrably false, for reasons we'll get into a little bit later. The very idea of so-called phantom time in history isn't exactly new, nor is it totally unheard of even today in other fields, such as young Earth creationism, which ignores some 5 billion years of Earth's history. What would be called the phantom time hypothesis has a few fathers, starting with a group of 18th century French Jesuits who were convinced that Greek and Roman society didn't exist and that artistic and historic evidence of any kind were forgeries. And there's no doubt that there are probably days missing or misinterpreted here or there along the way. Remember, before a few hundred years ago, normal people didn't read, they didn't write, and they certainly had no way to comprehend a calendar, nonetheless double-check its math, which they were largely ignorant of. People fundamentally understood the flow of time, and certain times of year marked certain events, harvests, days of celebration, etc., but they didn't have a deep understanding of the passage of time, and accepted what literate scholars and clergy told them. In its modern form, though, the phantom time hypothesis is the intermingling brainchild of 3 European scholars, and really, 2 of them are the ones largely responsible for the 297-year gap theory as we know it. Their names are Anatoly Fomenko, Hans-Ulrich Nemitz, and Herbert Illig. Fomenko, a Russian mathematician, has suggested that a full 1,000 years or so were at some point added to the modern calendar, asserting that even well-known Egyptian, Middle Eastern, and Far Eastern histories were partially or wholly fake. The far more grounded 297-year gap theory, and I'm using the word grounded very loosely, is the realm of Nemitz and Illig. Unfortunately, most of these guys' papers and studies remain stranded in their native Russian and German languages, with some exceptions, leaving a sort of hodgepodge of random websites to garner information from, some more reputable than others. But the general gist between all of the sources I've read are the same. Some combination of Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, and Catholic Pope Sylvester II conspired to rework the calendar just over 1,000 years ago, accelerating time while making it seem like nothing had changed at all. And since at the time records were so scarce, literacy was so rare, and history and lore blended together so much, no one apparently was the wiser, or so they say. And a few hundred years later, according to these scholars and their adherents, a change in calendar system revealed the entire ruse right before everyone's eyes. If it sounds crazy, it's because it is, but that's what makes conspiracy theories so fascinating and why I wanted to focus on this one in particular as opposed to, say, the moon landing conspiracy theory or the 9/11 conspiracy theories or the JFK assassination conspiracy theories is because, well, this one is lesser known. It's almost completely unknown, in fact. I had never heard of it. And I feel like it's a good look into how conspiracy theories grow and how they become kind of infatuated with certain facts that render their point positive and ignore everything else. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of exactly how this occurred, or so they say. To fully understand what the phantom time hypothesis puts forth and to comprehend what it's all about, 2 years in history are important: 46 BC, BC meaning before Christ, and 1582 CE. Back in the year 46 BC, the famous Roman dictator Julius Caesar helped shepherd in a new calendar known to history as the Julian Calendar. The Julian Calendar is essentially identical to our own modern calendar, which we'll talk about in just a moment, with 365 full days split into 12 months of varying lengths. Some of its structure was moved around over time, but ultimately, the Julian Calendar was the common way to measure the flow of time for more than 1,500 years, and some major countries on Earth, such as Russia, stuck with it well into the 20th century. But there was a problem, one that's actually still built into our calendar today, but to a lesser and far more manageable extent. The solar year, as in the literal time it takes for the Earth to revolve around the sun once, isn't a perfect 365 Earth days long, as determined by the rotation of the planet. And even observing a leap year every 4 years, as we still do today, each year observed by the Julian system was still an additional nearly 11 minutes too long. Taken over long periods of time, 11 minutes a year starts to add up. The leap year as instituted took care of the quarter of a day that accumulated at the end of the year, but left the 11 minutes dangling. Before you know it, you have excess days that you cannot avoid, and the Julian calendar was not equipped to deal with this reality. Important dates that coincided with natural phenomena, like equinoxes, were totally thrown off, and it was a problem that needed fixing, because the longer the problem went on, the more incomprehensible the calendar threatened to be. Fast forward now to the aforementioned year of 1582 CE. This is the year that Catholic Pope Gregory XIII introduces a new calendar, which history fittingly named after him, the Gregorian Calendar. This is the calendar we still use to this day. There's nothing different between the Julian and Gregorian calendars, right down to the leap year every 4 years, except for one thing. That annual nearly 11-minute gap has been ameliorated by eliminating a leap year every 100 years, with the exception of every 400 years. In other words, while the year 2000 was indeed a leap year, 2100, 2200, and 2300 won't be leap years. 2400 in turn will be a leap year, and so on and so forth. If you study history, you'll sometimes notice the term OS next to a date, which indicates it's a date based on the so-called Old Style, or Julian calendar. But we live very much in the Gregorian realm, and we rely on this fix to this day to keep everything flowing in an orderly fashion. But there's a catch. To institute the Gregorian calendar, Pope Gregory XIII needed to erase a bit of time moving forward in order to remove the extra days that had accumulated since the reign of Julius Caesar. You saw a similar thing happen when the Russians, as an example, finally abandoned the Julian system a century ago. Specifically, there's an extra day in the mix for every 128 years or so that pass. Mathematically, 13 days should have been removed at that point to zero out the calendar, as it were, but Pope Gregory XIII only removed 10, which is at the very heart of the conspiracy. In 1582, the days October 4th through October 14th were stricken from the record. They never happened in Gregorian timekeeping. Time flowed from October 4th to October 15th in 1582, and the 15th of October was the first day of the Gregorian calendar as contemporarily used. It's here that the conspiracy heats up. To some, Gregory XIII's dubious math, arriving at 10 days instead of 13 days, indicates that he was aware of a date-changing conspiracy that occurred centuries earlier, and was compensating appropriately for it. So now we've set the stage. We understand what's going on with the calendar systems, why the calendars needed to kind of change, that the Julian calendar was a nice solution compared to a lot of earlier calendars that were woefully off. But at the same time, it had this one major problem that as 1,500 years had passed, had kind of drawn up basically an extra 2 weeks of time that are unaccounted for. The Gregorian calendar strives to take care of this, and Pope Gregory XIII was trying to take care of it. But why did he leave off 10 days instead of 13? Rewind nearly 600 years prior to the time of Gregory XIII, and you're in the realm of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, who lived for fewer than 22 years, being born in the summer of 980 and dying early in the year of 1002. The phantom time hypothesis says that, with the help of Pope Sylvester II, and perhaps inspired by the actual historical rewriting of Byzantine history undertaken by Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, 297 years worth of time were stricken in order to make Otto III rule at the turn of the millennium. It's a weak motive to center a conspiracy theory on, but that's basically it. That ruling at the 1000 mark would legitimize and strengthen Otto III, a man well known for his ruthless ambition and eye for compelling lore. If we fast forward to Gregory XIII, his math was therefore off by 3 days to make up for the fact that, according to the theory, nearly 300 fewer years had actually in reality passed. So Gregory XIII didn't have to compensate for them. He was aware of the conspiracy theory that happened with one of his predecessors hundreds of years ago, as it's suggested. So why adjust for time that only happened on paper? Of course, that's utter nonsense. Gregory XIII's mathematical rationale was actually fairly straightforward. Course correcting by 10 days brought the calendar back into balance, though not all the way. A sacrifice the Pope was willing to nonetheless make because way back in 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea, a prominent meeting of very early Christian leaders, settled on a date for Easter, at the time considered the holiest of holidays. By only going back 10 days instead of 13, Gregory XIII lined up the Gregorian calendar's Easter with the term set by that council. In other words, he was only interested in making up the time between his day and that council, not his day and the reign of Julius Caesar, which occurred right before the historical Jesus Christ was even born. But proponents of the phantom time hypothesis see things just a little bit differently. They see a situation in which powerful elites took advantage of a populace that didn't know any better, whose history was largely passed down by inconsistent lore, and who couldn't rip through any tomes themselves to corroborate what was or wasn't happening. To be fair, a few points ancillarily strengthen the phantom time argument, primarily circumstantial evidence that could never truly culminate in any sort of definitive proof. It's true that forgeries from the Dark Ages and Middle Ages are incredibly common, not only made contemporarily in order to trick collectors, museums, and scholars, but made in the past to fill in gaps in history and storytelling. The Catholic Church itself mastered forgeries, and was in on the game for a very long time. That, combined with a substantial lack of concrete and verifiable archaeological, historical, and cultural evidence from the time, indicates that maybe those years didn't exist. Just like the New Testament itself, which was written well after Jesus and his contemporaries were alive, and were based on passed down histories and stories, the suggestion is that people simply wrote things later to make up for a gap, and sometimes that stuff is entirely made up. To make the rewritten, falsified history plausible, however, proponents suggest that a cadre of fakers created, out of whole cloth, important historical figures, like Alfred the Great, King Edward of England, and most notably, Charlemagne himself. Proponents point at evidence ranging from a building moratorium in Constantinople that ranges over those dates indicated, to a church called the Chapel of Aachen, which was reportedly built in the 800s using techniques that weren't even around at the time. In other words, evidence that the perpetrators of the conspiracy would have never taken into account, or that anyone would ever notice. Of course, the evidence to the contrary is overwhelming and entirely convincing. For starters, there are artifacts from the phantom time date range. Although carbon dating can be an inexact science, it's considered largely reliable, even though phantom time conspiracy theorists claim otherwise. Likewise, the entire study of dendrochronology, literally the dating of tree rings to times in history, is a point of contention with these conspiracy theorists, but is a widely respected science. But really, the most compelling evidence wholly disproving the phantom time hypothesis comes from two totally separate academic fields: astronomy and history. Predictable astronomical events, like the return of a comet or the motions of the planets, happen like, well, clockwork. A heavenly body like Halley's Comet was recorded in multiple places in the world, including in Europe, the Middle East, and China, in the years 760 and 837, which both fall within the missing time range. There are tons of astronomical examples just like this that destroy the phantom time hypothesis. History is also an issue, as many who dismiss the hypothesis rightly claim that the entire theory is Eurocentric. For instance, the Tang dynasty ruled in China for much of the phantom time gap, and they left plenty of evidence of their existence. So too did the early Islamic faith, which was founded during the early range of the so-called phantom time, and by the time the end came, Islam had spread to places throughout the known world. If the conspiracy theory is true, then Islam was founded and then widely spread in what amounts to a historical blink of an eye. In other words, the phantom time hypothesis is a fascinating what-if of history, but as you can see, it's not true. Fear not, you don't live in the 18th century, you're here in the 21st century. Snug as a bug. Alright, that's it for this historical and conspiratorial episode of Colin's Last Stand. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, thumb up the video if you liked it, thumb it down if you don't. Please share it with friends and family, and leave comments down there in the comments below, and I'll be glad to speak with some of you down there as well. Again, I appreciate your time. I'll see you next time for more Colin's Last Stand. I hope this video found you well, and I hope to find you well next time. Keep on learning.